everybody. And please, Garrett, will conduct the questions and the presentation of Guy. Thank you very much, Guy, for coming and being here with us.
Thank you, Daniel. I hope it works this time.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Sorman, for joining us here today. You have a great transcendence all across the globe, and especially in Latin America, so it's a big honor to have you here with us. I wanted to remind our audience that you were the very first guest that the Fundación Internacional para la Libertad had in 1995, after you published your book in 1983, the Liberal Solution. So it's a really big honor to have you here with us today and to talk about a lot of things. The panel, this event has a title, I'm roughly translating, United States, China, and the World in the Post-Pandemic. So I think that we have a lot of things that we can discuss today, and that will be quite interesting for the people gathered here today. We'll have, I guess, around 20 or 30 minutes of discussion, asking you a few questions, and then questions from the audience, if we have enough time, so we can take advantage of having you here with us today. Monsieur Sorman, I think that the very first question, it's kind of obvious, but nonetheless, it's really important, and you've been always quite vocal on what you think about this issue, and it has to do with the role and the responsibility that China has in this pandemic that we are living today. Could you expose and talk us a little bit about that?
Sure. First of all, in the human history, I mean, this pandemic is not really something unexpected and new. Pandemic is a recurrent phenomenon in human history. We know that. We also know that many of these pandemics in the 20th century come from China, which is something to be remembered. Why China? Because in China, the basic notion of public hygiene are lacking. And also you have a tradition of close contact between animals and human beings. This is why, for example, the influenza, the so-called Asian influenza in 57 came from China. Again, in 68, we had a pandemic coming from China. So there is something in China which has to do with the Chinese culture and with the absence of regulation in the way people interact with animals. So this is a historical factor which must be taken into consideration. Now, with this pandemic, we have another dimension, which is the political or ideological dimension. We very well know that the pandemic or the epidemic started in China, in Wuhan. We don't know exactly when, probably late October. And when it became evident in January, we know that several medical researchers in Wuhan tried to alert the Chinese government, and they were repressed for that, and one of them died, by the way. And so China confessed that it was a global pandemic after millions of Chinese had been infected, but it was too late in a way to control the pandemic. So the direct responsibility lies not with China, not with the Chinese people, but with the Chinese leadership and with the totalitarian ideology in China, where only good news are promoted and bad news are repressed. So it's the first time in history where we can follow exactly how the pandemic started and how it became global. And of course, we'll have to draw some consequences about this responsibility of China, political, economic, and geopolitical consequences, because what happens once will be repeated. I mean, the factors which have created these global epidemics are still there. The lack of hygiene in China is still there. the ideology is still there, so the risk is still there. And so far, the rest of the world has not taken a collective position to answer what remains a threat with a clear ideological and I would say totalitarian origin.
Monsieur Sorman, you have mentioned so many important issues in the past few minutes. You talked about a confession from China, which came way too late, it seems. I mean, it truly seems that it really came too late, that confession. You also mentioned the fact that this is probably the first time in recorded history that we are able to follow exactly how the pandemic started, where it started, and how it kept growing. And then you mentioned the possibility of repetition, right? Tied with a totalitarian regime and authoritarian ways of dealing with public policy. Some authors have tied this idea that what happened in China could be akin to what happened in Chernobyl, despite the differences, of course, one with nuclear power and the other with a pandemic. But the idea behind the hiding of something that, had we known beforehand what was going on, we could have prevented it. Do you agree that there's this idea that ties with secrecy and with trying to hide what's really going on in these communist countries?
Yes. Many people, of course, have compared Chernobyl and what happened in China, but there is a huge difference. It's true that the kind of totalitarian ideology which existed at that time in the Soviet Union and which is existing in China are very similar. But the consequences are very, very different. Because as we remember, Chernobyl was seized as a pretext by Gorbachev to change the regime. And Gorbachev said, we cannot go on like that. We need to build a more open system in order to save the country for this kind of disaster. So this system is corrupt, and Chernobyl is a consequence of the system, okay? In China, it's exactly the contrary. The Chinese leadership said, well, we'll reinforce the control of the population, and there is no way that will open the country to some kind of a freedom of information. So the political consequences are totally different, and it goes very far because perestroika destroyed the regime. In China, it's exactly the contrary. It has reinforced the regime. It has given good reason or bad reason to the government of Xi Jinping to repress even more the freedom of information. And they are very good at propaganda. Now they explain that it was a war and they won the war, and they give China as an example to the rest of the world. So same starting point and totally opposite consequences.
That's really, really interesting, that comparison between Gorbachev and the Chinese regime. That's really food for thought, what you're telling us, Monsieur Sorman. I'm going to take you to the other side of the title of this event. We just talked a little bit about China. We'll continue speaking about China, but I think it's time that America, United States of America, enters the picture in this talk. And every year is pretty special in the States, but this one in particular, because they have elections in November, and everything is taking this really politically party-tied discussion. You have Trump now trying to go across the states with rallies and with events, and he keeps using words that the Democrats don't like, and he just said, for example, kung fu regarding the coronavirus. What can you tell us about what's going on in the United States right now, if you had to describe the situation, the political situation there nowadays?
Well, I happen to be in the United States, and I'm really terrified by what I see, because the United States is right now in a process of self-destruction. I mean, biggest democracy in the world, the strongest economy in the world, the hope of the nations, is really self-destructing. I can't find a better word. Why? I think Trump is heavily responsible, you know, to politicize the pandemic the way he's doing these days, to say, to wear a mask, to keep your distance, to be cautious, not to infect your parents or grandparents. This is a political statement. So I would never imagine that the President of the United States would politicize a pandemic and would not act as a decent leader. He never said a word of empathy for the thousands and thousands of people who are dying still every day. And we can see the consequence. The consequence is that the pandemic today is much worse than it was 2 or 3 months ago. And if you are a Trump supporter, a Republican, you have to show your support by not wearing a mask, by not respecting social distancing. Well, I've never seen that in history. I wouldn't never expect this kind of politicization of the pandemic. So I consider Trump now to be a criminal. I do consider that this behavior, his speeches, the negation of the pandemic, the negation of racism, which is a fact. I mean, you cannot discuss, it is a fact. White policemen are actually killing Black people. And this ignorance is dividing the country as it never was divided since Lincoln became the president. And this leads not only to an extension of the pandemic, to more and more dead people every day, but it leads to a kind of civil war between the Americans, not only between white people, but between white people and white people, between white people and Latinos, between white people, Latinos, and Black people. So he's playing this card, which is quite typical of a fascist regime. It reminds us of Mussolini, the way he seized power. And the economic consequences, as we know, are dramatic, because as long people get sick, they will never get back to work. Even if you reopen schools, you reopen universities, you reopen firms, people are not totally crazy. They don't go, they don't work. So the recession will be absolutely dramatic. Now, third pillar of the American influence was geopolitics, and America, the United States of America, has become, as we know, a totally unreliable ally for the whole world. Nobody trusts the United States anymore. So this is a process of self-destruction, which we saw, which Americans lived in the 1860s before the Civil War. And I may sound a little bit dramatic, but the big question now is, will Trump leave when he will be beaten in November? When you look at the figures, I mean, this morning, Biden has an advance of 14%, okay? So I would bet that Trump will be beaten by a landslide. Will he accept his defeat? That's the big question. We really don't know. It could lead towards some kind of a civil war in the United States. Trump supporters carried arms. They could use them. So we are in a very dangerous situation. And then if he leaves, if Biden is elected, has Biden the energy and the charisma to rebuild this country? This is still an open question. Well, some of my friends in the United States are much more optimistic and say, well, this country has proved many, many times that it can always reinvent itself and rebuild itself. So I'm rather an optimistic. I'm very pessimistic in the months to come until November. And I do think that if the Americans can get rid of Trump, yes, there is enough energy to rebuild this country, enough talent, enough innovation. And the military, you know, are very remote from politics. They don't want to get involved because they know that they have a role to play if they want to keep the world safe, but with another president.
Monsieur Sorman, so many good points to dissect and continue deepening our knowledge thanks to you. Before we continue on them, I would actually like to pose you a counterfactual that I very much think that what you could tell us about it would be probably the best person in the position to speak about this, because you are most definitely the world-renowned expert on Alexis de Tocqueville, right? And since Tocqueville visited the States because he wanted to learn about American democracy and because he wanted to deepen his knowledge and all that, those issues, what do you think Tocqueville would say now if he went to the States? It's 2020, he's in the amidst a pandemic, he's seeing Trump, he's seeing the elections that are coming. What would Alexis de Tocqueville say right now, do you think, about the States?
You know, in my family, every time I quote Tocqueville, I have to give $1 to my wife or to my children because they're really exhausted with my Tocquevillian quotes. But it's true that in Tocqueville, you find really everything. Now, he would not be that much surprised. If you read carefully Tocqueville, he was describing something totally new, which was the democratic revolution. And when you talk about democracy in America, he doesn't talk that much about institution. He talks about equality, and he says that Americans are crazy about equality, and equality comes first. And if they had to choose between freedom and equality, they would choose equality. So Tocqueville was basically a pessimist. He regretted that the elite, the aristocracy or the educated people would have less and less power in a democracy. So the word did not exist, but if the word existed, I think he would have described the United States as a populist society, not a democratic society. So what we see is the rise of populism. And I don't think he would be that much surprised, because in his book, he says, the future is very uncertain. And the risk of populism destroying freedom is huge in the United States. So he would be terrified, but he would not be surprised, because all the elements that we describe now, populism, ignorance, fake news, etc., violence, all this was already in Tocqueville time, and he really underlined the risks and the danger of this situation.
Monsieur Sorman, moments before you mentioned that the United States is in a process of self-destruction, a process that probably had Trump as one of the biggest catalysts in recent times, and due to him and his ways of dealing with American politics and with international politics. I think that there's this truism that from history that probably everybody learns, even in school, that all empires are doomed to fall at some point, right? We learn about the Roman Empire, and we learn about all those ancient tribes and civilizations that were before us, and then someday they stopped being so great and so awesome and so awe-inspiring. And you said Trump will lose. Probably he will most definitely lose against Biden or whoever the Democrats end up putting against him, and most probably by a landslide. Do you? And you said you were a pessimist more than an optimist, even though you had a lot of friends who were optimists. If the states fall, in a sense, for example, if they are not this big empire that they used to be, do you think that China will try to regain their momentum and try to become the world leaders?
Well, first of all, my position is to say that America right now is in a very dangerous situation, and there is this process of self-destruction. I'm not saying that America will disappear, because as I said before, you have kind of a balance between self-destruction forces and the incredible energy of these people, and still the strongest army in the world, the best universities, and the best researchers coming from all over the world. So it's an open situation. It's an open situation. I'm not among the scholars who say the American empire is doomed. I don't know. I said the risks are there, but the chances to recover are there as well. So I would not bet. I would not bet. If I were to bet, if you force me to make a choice, I do think that the resources of the American people will take over, and that self-destruction is a risk, but I don't consider that it is a certainty. So the era of American dominance, in a way, you like it or you don't, I don't think it's over. If it's over, I don't think China is in a position to replace the United States as a dominant power, because China is a relatively poor country if compared to Europe, compared to the United States. The Chinese military are not as well equipped as the European or the American military, but moreover, there's a huge ideological difference. America, United States of America, is kind of a universal model. Democracy, freedom, entrepreneurship, free market, open debate, multiculturalism, openness to different culture, freedom of religion. This is American. It's also universal. Disneyland is American, but it is universal. Okay, you don't have a Chinese Disneyland. Why? Because the Chinese are very nationalistic and parochial. They do not offer a model for the world. They offer a model for China. I mean, nobody wants to go and live in China. No students is running to learn in a Chinese universities. We are not learning Chinese, we are learning English. And once again, where is the China Disneyland? When I say that, there is no Chinese dream which is universal. Therefore, to be a dominant power like the United States, you must be accepted as a dominant power. You must be recognized as a dominant power. In the case of China, China is using its strength, but it provokes backlash, like we see in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, tomorrow in India. So you cannot be a leader if you are not accepted as a leader. You know, if you go back to the Roman Empire, I mean, the Roman Empire was accepted because they were promoting universal values and they were respecting the individual rights of the people within the empire. So this notion of Chinese empire just does not apply to our current world. China will be rejected, it will be opposed, and once again, I repeat myself, but keep this image of Disneyland. As long as you don't have a Chinese Disneyland where we all recognize ourselves and take our kids to this Chinese Disneyland, there will never be a Chinese empire beyond the Chinese borders.
Well, thank you very much, Monsieur Sorman. I would like to bring you now to a country that's at least a little more little than the ones we've been discussing. Many of the people here present in the audience are from this country. You have spoken a lot, written a lot about this country, and you're probably figuring out which one I'm talking about. You even spoke before the elections here. I'm talking about Argentina, which is now, of course, amid a pandemic, as well as the whole globe, but with a Peronist in power, with the Kirchners in power again. What can you tell us about Argentina? How are you seeing us from abroad?
Well, Argentina, you know I love Argentina, okay? You know, I've been in your country so many times. I've there so many friends. I mean, Argentina is quite a contradiction, which is unique. You know, when I was a student long time ago in the Paris Institute of Political Sciences, we had a professor in economics who said there are three kinds of economy. The capitalist economy, the socialist economy, and Argentina. So Argentina as such is a category which is full of contradiction, because you have a dominant culture, music, literature, theater, okay, I mean ballet, I mean it's a very impressive culture in Latin America, and which is recognized all over the world. You have some brilliant universities, you have great academics, you have a fantastic class of entrepreneurs who are really leaders, mostly in agriculture. You have the most scientific agriculture and productive agriculture in the world, and nothing works. Nothing works because Argentina was never able to, for mysterious reasons, to find the institutions which are absolutely necessary to have a stable and growing country. So there is this, and also politics never attracted the better people. So on one side, you have all the qualities and requirements of a ultra developed and fascinating country, as I say, entrepreneurship, academics, and so on. On the other side, it's like you have a different country, which are the political institution and the political class. And you have never been able to reconcile these two dimensions of Argentina. So you try, you fail. And the Menem tried at the very beginning, and then he failed. Macri tried, and then he failed. And the Peronists, you cannot get rid of them. And so maybe the liberals, and we do represent the liberals, okay? Maybe the liberals have not been able to propose a vision of the society which would incorporate everyone. And the liberals maybe are too dogmatic, and they're very, in a way, prisoner of traditional liberal thinking, free market individualism and all that, but they do not incorporate two dimensions of the Argentinian society, nationalism and poverty. What is our answer as liberal to nationalism, or to put it another way, to identity? mean, liberals are cosmopolitans, but maybe Argentinians are not cosmopolitan. They are not global citizens. They are Argentinian citizens. They like their football team, okay? And the football comes before what happens. And so we liberals have to define what is Argentinian identity. How do you reconcile liberal philosophy, which is rather individualistic, and the very deep links between many Argentinian people and Argentina as a nation? So we have to incorporate this concept of identity in our philosophy. And second, what is a liberal answer to poverty? Free market is not enough. We need to find a way. And I personally promote in France and other countries this notion of universal minimal income so that everybody would not live in fear and would accept the impact of new technology and the impact of globalization. So in a nutshell, we have to look at our own responsibility, and liberals in Argentina should come with a program which would be maybe less dogmatic than it used to be. Liberals in Argentina were and still are a bit dogmatic, and propose their definition of national identity and their solution against mass poverty. I think this is the way we can reconcile these two Argentinas.
Well, thank you, Monsieur Sorman. This has been a great talk. We can go to this another section from our talk, and we'll get to read some of the questions from people in the audience and to get your answers on them. We'll try to get through as many as we can in the minutes that we have left. We have one from Juan Felix, who says, Mr. Sorman, you mentioned that in November there is a chance Trump doesn't accept his defeat, but what can he do?
It's a very complicated legal debate which has already started. If it is a landslide and there is no debate about the result, he may leave. But as we know, the rules are extremely complicated because the Americans vote state by state, and usually you lose or you win a state by a very narrow margin. And we know that also because of the pandemic, millions of fake voters will vote by mail. And Trump already started saying, well, this vote by mail is fraud. So most probably he will be in a position where he could say, well, it seems that I lost, but it's not that evident. And let's ask the Supreme Court to make the final decision. And the Supreme Court is rather conservative, so we don't know what could the Supreme Court decide. Now, this is the optimistic scenario. There is a more pessimistic scenario where Trump would call his supporters and say, look, this is not an election, this is a revolution to get rid of me. So go to the street and fight for your rights. And you'll have kind of a civil war. Then who makes the final decision? More and more, there are two possibilities. The Republican Party can decide enough of Trump. This is what they said with Nixon. Nixon didn't want to leave, but the Republican Party says, enough, go home, okay? And Nixon, having lost the support of the Republican Party, left. And then the ultimate solution is the military. And the military are legally in a position to remove the president if he has lost the election. But it's a totally new ball game, you know, so everybody these days are talking about hypotheses, but there is not a clear-cut solution because it never happened before.
We have more questions. One from Jose Venegas. He wants to know what you think about the way that other countries and other authorities have handled this sanitary issue, countries that are not China, because he thinks that maybe some countries have not gotten to the authoritarian extreme that China did, but in many cases, decisions and solutions have been centralized.
Yes. The way governments have handled this pandemic has not been fantastic. And maybe there are some exceptions like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. They reacted in a more clever way because they immediately understood that this was a pandemic, and they already had a strategy in place because they had been confronted to similar situations. And they got good results. And they were not that strong governments. I mean, if you look at Hong Kong and Taiwan, even South Korea, those are rather weak governments and democratic government. But if, so the problem is not strong or weak government. The problem is you have a clear strategy, you are able to explain your strategy, and then it works. What happens is that the countries which were able to have a strategy, South Korea, to explain the strategy, the people understood, accepted, played the game, and got good results, okay? Now, other countries, either they did not understand what was going on, like France or the United States or UK, which is worse. I will not mention Brazil. And they did not understand, they had no strategy, and therefore they lost the confidence of the people. So all these parameters combined explain why some countries did better than others. So it's not such a debate between, you know, strong central power, authoritarian, no. It's a debate about having clear strategy and be able to explain to the people. And then if the people understand, they are not stupid, they want to survive, so they do follow the guidelines. You know, in the United States, what happens now is that all states have different strategies. You know, New York closed down. Everybody understood why, because Governor Cuomo was very good at explaining why he was doing this. It works. The virus has nearly disappeared in here. Texas, Florida, the governors were totally confused and they sent contradictory messages, and the result is horrible. So the United States is a good example because you can compare state by state and you see the importance of the strategy and explaining the strategy and having the people follow the guidelines.
We have another question from Rafael Micheletti. He says, Mr. Sorman said China does not have a model to offer, but they are developing a digital dictatorship that seems very efficient and they can export it to other countries. They can also ally with local authoritarian ideologies and use them. Isn't this a possible base for disputing American hegemony? Are we heading to a second World War in the second Cold War in the 21st century?
Well, you cannot really export an ideology. If you look at the Soviet Union, for example, they did not export their ideology, they imposed their ideology by military force on their own people to start with, and then on Eastern Europe and other countries like Afghanistan or Nicaragua. So an ideology is not something you buy, okay? And if you look at the United States, they did not impose an ideology. Some countries bought it, some others did not. So an ideology is not just something like you buy or you don't buy, it's imposed or not imposed, okay? And I wouldn't say that China is an ideological system. It is an authoritarian or totalitarian system without an ideology. Because basically, if you ask me what is the Chinese ideology, I cannot answer. It was communism, then there's some kind of Confucianism, now it's nationalism. So you don't have a coherent ideology in China. And once again, it's very different from the United States, where you can describe, or Europe, where you can describe what is the mindset of the Europeans, what is the mindset of the Americans. You can't say that about the Chinese, and you even do not know what the Chinese people think. You don't know. It depends, because if you speak with scholar dissidents, a human rights lawyer, they hate the regime, but they cannot tell it, or they are sent to jail, okay, or they are killed, like Liu Xiaobo. And now, does this lead to some kind of Cold War? I think the situation is totally different because the Chinese are terribly dependent on the rest of the world. Their market is the world. So if you look at the Chinese strategy, commercial or military strategy, they're in fact very cautious not to disrupt all the commercial links that they have with the rest of the world. Because basically their economic success is based on us buying Chinese goods. So they don't want to disrupt that. And they have a very long-term strategies, maybe 30 years, 50 years. But right now, what is very significant with the Chinese, they will avoid any major confrontation which could disrupt the global order, because they are the first beneficiaries of the global order. And Xi Jinping last year at Davos in Switzerland, I was there, Xi Jinping says, I'm the strongest advocate of globalization and free trade. So no Cold War in the coming years.
No Cold War. We have around 8 minutes before we get to the allotted time that we had organized for this event, and we're going to try to cover some more questions. From Marcelo Plana, which is a question that has been appearing a lot. Can you go deeper in the description of what you mentioned as a universal minimal income?
Yes. If you look in I mean, all our regimes, all of our democracies are more or less social democrat to a certain extent. And but we have to look carefully at the way social expenses and public money is distributed among the people. And what you see is that in most of the cases, this welfare state, in this welfare state, the money is used for political purpose, buying votes. And Argentina has been very good at that, where you have a lot of social expenses. When you look at the figures, it's impressive, but where does the money go? Basically, it goes to buy votes. So it doesn't bring any sense of safety or equality between the people. So what I suggest to make things very simple is to erase, to suppress all kinds of social policies which actually exist, because they are very politicized and they are not honest, and they in a way, they do not stabilize the society. On the contrary, they destabilize the society, because you have people living from the welfare state and people living in poverty and people living from their work. Okay, you have three categories of people. So let's erase theoretically all social policies. Look at how much money we have in the state coffer and decide that every citizen at an age which is to be defined will receive a certain amount of money, the same for everyone, and then everyone will be on his own. I mean, you can invest this money, you can send your children to school, you can drink your money if you like. It's not a government responsibility. So this notion of universal basic income bring safety and equality. The cost for the state is the equivalent of the former social policies, and it is a philosophical choice because it supposes that the people, when they have received this monthly or yearly amount of money, they are on their own, they are responsible for their own destiny, and it is not the public democracy, the public bureaucracy which decide how you will use the money which is given to you by the welfare state. And this has been described in many economic books. I mean, at what time it has been supported by my good friend Milton Friedman, but he did not invent this concept. This concept is much older. It goes back to the 1930s. And I think I've been accused of being a socialist in France because I've promoted this idea. I say, no, it is the reverse of socialism. In socialism, governments make the decision in your name. In liberalism, you do help the people because the role of the government is to avoid, total poverty, but you totally trust the people for using the money which would be given to them on an egalitarian basis.
Thank you, Monsieur Sorman. We have a lot of questions because we have not spoken about this country yet, about Venezuela. How are you looking and analyzing the Venezuelan situation?
Well, I wonder if it's still a country, because millions of Venezuelans are migrated to Colombia and to Chile, Peru, and Ecuador. So the country is totally destroyed. What is left of the country is a group of people which have been bought by the government, and with the money which is left in the state coffer because of oil and less, the government has systematically destroyed the private sector. Some people don't understand what is the government strategy. The destruction of the private sector, impoverishment of the people, it's not an accident. It is part of the strategy so that the people who remain in Venezuela become totally dependent, like slaves of the political regime. This is the current situation. I mean, too often I read comments and I see it's terrible, the economy is in bad shape. The government wants it to be in a bad shape, to be the only actor so that the people will be totally dependent on the central government. Now, regretfully, it seems that no opposition force, neither the military, are in a position to counter this strategy. But the first thing which needs to be done is to clearly understand and define what is the strategy and the purpose of this government, which people neither in Venezuela nor outside clearly understand at this stage.
Well, it's almost 1 p.m. here in Argentina. It's the time that we had with you today. We really wanted to thank you, Monsieur Sorman, Guy Sorman, for joining us here today, for having you talk and converse with us. It has been a great honor for all of us here together, and we really want to thank you. I imagine people must be clapping on their sides of the screens. We will not open the mics because it might be chaos if we do that, but we can imagine that people are enthused and happy with this event. And we want to thank everybody here for being with us today. And we want to really thank you, Monsieur Sorman, for joining us.
Muchas gracias. And next time we meet in Rosario or someplace like that. Okay.
Definitely. That's a promise. We'll do that in the future.
Definitely, Guy. Definitely.
Thank you for your invitation. Okay, Danielle?
Thank you very much, Guy. Thank you very much. And yes, please, next time when the pandemic goes over, in Argentina, everything in Argentina or in Spain or whatever.
Absolutely. Let's make Argentina first. Bye-bye now. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, I promise it. Thank you very much.